Sorry, Reese. I thought it was Steve, sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'm Reese Jones, and I'm going to talk to you about singularities, synthetic biology, and some future things that we'll talk more about on Friday. So for me, I have an interest in the science behind human experience and the inner workings of how we think and what we experience. And my plan when I was an academic was to stay in academic research in medicine in the university, and I was working on brain imaging to look for the chemical defect in schizophrenia and bipolar disorders in humans. And this is an example of a PET image with a picture of a person in different states of thinking. And a PET machine puts a lot of cameras around a person's head to measure the radioactive emissions from the chemical that you're putting in to measure the chemistry. And you'll notice there's a lot of wires attached to this machine, and normally it's inside a casing that you don't see that. Now, while I was doing this research, which is very productive, for example, here's a CAT scan compared to a sugar PET scan compared to a special kind of molecule that I was working with, and you can combine together to locate tumors or look at chemical defects in the brain. My hobby at the time at the university was phone hacking, and I was part of the homebrew computer club. And so while I was working on this brain research for fun, we would play with the largest, most complicated machine that humans have ever made, which is the worldwide phone network. And at that time, when you made a sound, a whistle, just at the right frequency, the telephone network would turn into maintenance mode. And this was first discovered by blind people who had perfect pitch, and they could make that sound that would program the phone network. And the phone companies quickly figured that out and thus became hacking and the beginning of hacking. So there's a picture of Steve Wozniak in the dorm at Berkeley with a blue box, and Jobs and Wozniak with the Apple I computer. And this was a side group of the Homebrew Computer Club that I was part of that met occasionally here at the Stanford Linear Accelerator and other places in the Bay Area. And the hobby was how to figure out how the phone network works from the outside just by sending signals to the inside. And so the phone network has evolved into the internet and connects billions of people now. And hacking with sound has evolved into hacking with sound and data. But the idea is to, very much like brain imaging, to figure out how does the internet work and how does the phone network work from the outside looking in. So this, I'll transition into exponentials, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. You're familiar with the growth of the human population that's considered an exponential curve, and many instincts are that it will continue growing at this doubling rate indefinitely. But most things like this in biology actually flatten out. Once the resources are exhausted, the growth of a population, whether it's a plant or an animal or a microbe, slows down. However, some things continue to exponentially grow, like information technology. So many are familiar with what's called Moore's Law, which is the number of transistors you can fit on a silicon wafer doubling about every 18 months. And that's held true for an extended period. And computers get better on a doubling rate. Other things get better. Information technologies get better on a doubling rate. So, for example, I call this one Marty Cooper's law. Marty Cooper is the inventor of the cell phone. And this, over 100 years, is the speed that you can send information wirelessly. So in the time of the sinking of the Titanic 100 years ago, the speed of wireless communications at that time was Morse code and very slow. But very consistently, year over year, including through the invention of cell phones, through wars, through various economic uptimes and downtimes, it keeps getting better and better on a consistent basis. So now you could watch live stream of the Titanic sinking on HD video. But this appears to be continuing because it's information technology. It uses better radios, better signal processors, better microprocessors, and it may be some form of natural law. The same has been happening with computing before Moore's law and semiconductors on chips, back to vacuum tubes and even punch cards. So here's the price performance of computing over the same 100-year period, and you can see even on an exponential graph, it's following a very predictable curve. And so some people predict this into the future and consider when is it that the internet will be smarter than people, and what happens when something major like that transitions is unpredictable. We don't know what will happen when computers or the internet are smarter than people. And so this is a concept called a singularity. And it turns out there are many singularities. Singularity is a term that comes from physics from around 1916. It was the solution to Einstein's field equations that predicted black holes that weren't discovered for almost 100 years later. And a singularity was the term of falling into a black hole and changing from a predictable thing into an unpredictable thing. So it looks something like this mathematically, STEM being space, time, energy, and matter. In space, a simulation would look something like this, where the gravity strength of a black hole is strong enough to pull light back into it, so the light can't escape, and thus it looks like a black hole. Black holes are thought to be the center of most galaxies, and the attracting factor that pulls together the dust into solar systems and planets and so forth. And so black holes and singularity points are a common thing in physics. And if you'll note in this picture, a little yellow triangle in the upper top there and a circle going around the galaxy, that's Earth and the Kepler telescope looking ahead of where we're going to see planets that we might run into at some point. But you can see that the Kepler telescope can only see a very small part of this galaxy, much less others. So it turns out there are singularities here on Earth. And this is what some people call a glory hole in a lake not far from here, which is a singularity in that it's going from a predictable situation into unpredictability, where if you were swimming next to this hole and you fell over the edge, what would happen to you is unpredictable. And that's the main point. Here's an example of what that is. People like to play with singularities. They're curious. This is a group of people playing at the edge of an event horizon where they might fall off, but it's entertaining where you feel like you're in control of the situation. So a singularity basically means change into unpredictability. And some people like to experiment with that. So here's somebody thinking, well, what would happen if I went over that in a kayak boat, for example? And what happens now is unpredictable. Does he die? Does he get stuck on the rocks below? Does he come out in some way? It's an experiment with a singularity. His friends are wondering why he's not coming out. And it turns out he does survive that one. A little worse for wear, and not too happy, but alive. Now he's going to try it again, going over another singularity event horizon into an unpredictable outcome. And perhaps you've heard about the white light of death. So we don't know what happens to him in that situation. So a singularity just means change, and it means change from predictable into unpredictable. And that's what happens in a black hole. And the cosmologists and physicists are still debating whether, if I were to throw a clock into that black hole, would the information that the clock had be remembered as it came out the other side. So we set up 8 years ago university, Singularity University, to discuss these kinds of things, change in technology, moving from linear to exponential, and from predictable to unpredictable. And we'll talk more about that on Friday. One of the things that we cover there is programming in biology. And this is called biotechnology or synthetic biology or recombinant genetics and so forth. But the basic concept is our computers run on code, ones and zeros, and you can program the computers and phones in abstract languages, but basically transistors are ones and zeros. In biology, there's also code. It's in the DNA. It's the letters of genetics. And DNA can be treated like software, and you can write programs in DNA just like you write programs for computers, and you can write apps that run on living things. So you can use DNA as code, use the techniques that are done for computer development, and that these codes are essentially programs that run in living things. So reading and writing DNA is areas of technology that are happening very fast. So you can sequence the DNA from a person or an organism, change its design, change it back into DNA, put it back in the organism, and it's like loading a new app in your phone. And this is an area that's getting faster, approximately 5 times faster than Moore's Law, in that because it uses microscopes and robots and memory and processors and a lot of exponentially improving technologies, the combination of those to be able to read and soon write DNA are getting faster than computers and phones. The basic process is going from taking a sample from a living thing, using a robot and a sequencer to read the DNA and write the DNA. You can change it as software in a computer. You put it back into the biology using various techniques. And so, for example, you can write an app that runs in a bacteria or a yeast. And you can think of bacteria as like an Android and a yeast as like an iPhone. And you're writing apps that, for example, you load into yeast, brew the yeast into beer, and the beer not only makes beer, but it also can make the product of the program that you've added in. So an example of that is a chemical used, a lubricant that's used in cosmetics called squalene, that is normally commercially harvested from the livers of sharks, and many sharks are being killed to get this chemical that's used for cosmetic purposes. But you can take the DNA that's in the liver of that shark and copy it into a computer, edit the DNA so that it will run in yeast, brew the yeast in beer, and the beer will make beer, plus it'll make that chemical at the same time. So in a sense, you are making the same thing that was made in nature, but you're doing it synthetically, and you're using reprogrammed yeast to make it. So it turns out you can make almost anything in nature in this synthetic way. So it brings a new meaning to the word homebrew from the Homebrew Computer Club, which started out hacking phones and hacking computers. Now you can hack biology and make things using DNA in a brewing type method to make most kinds of materials. Just 6 years ago, the first completely synthetic organism made only out of parts. So going from a computer straight to something that was a living, reproducing organism, the picture in the top left there, was first published in 2010. And then the larger picture is something that just was done a month ago, which is the minimum genome living creature built completely out of parts. So there was no parents for this organism. The parents are computers, and the information in the living creature that can self-reproduce is just code that came from the computer. And the native organism above has about 1,000 genes, and the minimum viable creature has 473 genes in it. And if you take any one of those genes out, the organism can't reproduce and it dies. And so this is sort of the minimum viable life that is built completely out of parts and wasn't even possible 6 years ago. So that's a platform that you can add additional genes into to make new materials, new things in these platforms. So, for example, the spiders make a material that's many times stronger than steel and can be per weight and can be used in many different ways. And people have tried farming spiders, but it turns out they eat each other, so it doesn't work very well. But you can take the genes that are in these spiders and copy them out and put the genes into microbes of bacteria or yeast, grow the microbes like beer, and the microbes will actually grow spider silk just as if it's come from a spider, but it'll grow it in a container, and then you can harvest that spider silk or other kinds of silk and build things out of it. And so this is like a first early commercial application of building new materials. This is another application, which is building food out of stem cells. So this is synthetic meat that the people in the business like to call it cultured meat, where this is stem cells grown in an incubator or like a brewery into a full-on meat that can be pork or cows or other things. And this is many times more efficient than building a whole chicken or a whole cow or a whole pig to create the meat. So one of the things is, how do you get the program into the cell? Nature has ways to do that. These are bacteriophages, where you can put your code inside those little red objects, and they will, instead of injecting their virus code into the cell, they'll inject your program. And it turns out that you can make most anything by using a combination of yeast and sugar and changing the code that's in there. And the some chemicals are much more valuable than others. Turns out people started out doing this to make fuel, things like gasoline or whatnot. But the cost of pumping oil out of the ground is actually less than the cost of fresh water that you need to grow the yeast. So it's not economically feasible to make fuels this way. However, high-value chemicals like the squalene that I mentioned or spider silk, it's just a function of how much sugar is needed for the yeast to make the chemical that you've programmed in. And then I'll shift over to the complexity of life and free will, in that the minimum viable cell is fairly predictable in what it does, and a simple cell like a bacteria is relatively predictable. A yeast becomes less predictable in that it's a more complex organism, and sort of anecdotally it seems to have more free will. And when you get to plants or animals, they're less likely to run the same program that you've written in DNA than a simpler organism. So the minimum viable cell will almost certainly run your program because it's not doing anything else. But if you put the genes in that tree outside, it'll change its mind on a sunny day or a rainy day whether or not it chooses to run your program. So here's a biological computer interface of a somewhat more complicated biological system interacting with a digital system, kind of like humans do. And the system is working sort of predictably, but the organism can go unpredictable sometimes, has an element of free will. And so robots were mentioned earlier in that you can build robots out of mechanical parts. Another approach to robots is to add digital processors to living creatures. And so they're both equally efficient. And but we're familiar with robots that start out with needing a human operator, but as the computers get more sophisticated, they may not need the human. So here's Mark Zuckerberg in Barcelona, World Mobile Congress, with an audience full of people wearing VR helmets. And this is very high popular right now. The ultimate extension is, of course, you want to have something over your ears, something covering your body for haptic feedback, something doing your head, and even doing selfies of yourself in virtual reality. So like a skeptical view of the trajectory of virtual reality is a little bit like that. And this is a video from a movie that may give you a thought about VR.
He likes to butt things with his hand.
How proud you must be.
So one thing that is not popular in China so much yet is Facebook. And Facebook has over 1 billion people in the world who are attached to the network. And their activity is being tracked. And it's put into a database as to how people think. And the way that Facebook makes money is by advertising to those people. Now, those are like having people. This is a picture of Mechanical Turk, which is Amazon's product that you essentially hire people to do micro tasks, which is a function of using people as robotic components inside the internet to do things. An extension is a very popular product this year called Amazon's Alexa, which you basically speak to the cloud, and an AI system performs services for you, like getting you an Uber or getting you pizza and whatnot. And the AI behind this actually comes from people who they have millions or hundreds of millions or billions of users experience of saying, what you did is correct or what you did is not correct. And so AI behind it is often has a human element that is the database, and so there's sort of a phenomenon going on where if something is possible, like when Google's computer beat the world champion Go player at Go, people say that's not AI anymore, that's just software. And so AI is almost like a mythical thing that is moving forward where if it's possible, it's considered machine learning software. If it's not possible, then that might be AI. So we're familiar, to sort of wind up here, with robots that used to require a human driver. And elevators, when they were first introduced, usually had a human operator because they were considered unsafe and needed the intelligence of a human to operate the elevator. Now we're very comfortable in riding in autonomous elevators that have simple interfaces, and we're not so much afraid that it's going to do the wrong thing. That extends to robots that drive on the ground or fly through the air, that we assume at this stage that these things need a human driver or a human pilot to be a safe vehicle. But it's just a matter of time until vehicles that move on the ground or through the air become like elevators, in that as the computers that run them get exponentially smarter and more experience happens with human use, that the human operator part becomes unnecessary. Sort of a remaining kind of robot that I'll mention are those that fly through the air. This is Google's Loon Project, which are balloons that fly higher than commercial airplanes typically fly, and they basically deliver Wi-Fi to everywhere that they're over, much like a cellular network does. And they're putting up thousands of these around the world that will deliver high-speed Wi-Fi to the ground for free. And Google's another company that makes its money on advertising to the people that use its service, much like Facebook. So both of those companies can provide free internet and telephone and video and other kinds of services in exchange for the advertising. And these are kinds of digital disruptions that are happening that is a trend that just the example I'll touch on here is, say, Uber. Uber has now become the world's largest taxi company, but it doesn't own any taxis. It just provides the logistics service. And there's lots of other examples like that. So I'll conclude here with a picture of the routers on the internet over a 24-hour period to cycle back to brains, in that if you notice the colors changing across the screen, this is over a 24-hour period, following more or less where the sun is. And where the sun is, the routers are busy, people are using the internet, and it's yellow or red. And where it's nighttime, the people are sleeping and the internet is sleeping. And so this is basically a picture of the internet being awake and being asleep. And even if you look carefully in the blue, there's occasional yellow and red spots. And that's the internet dreaming, where the Google data centers or YouTube centers are synchronizing. And that's dreams of the internet that are quite a bit like dreams in humans. That is actually quite a bit like how schizophrenia is a problem in a complex human brain. So thank you very much.
谢谢 Reese。我们现在呢，接下来还有2个 speaker。今天这个时间过得也很快。然后我们所有的人讲完之后，我们可以跟我们今天的演讲者一起合影，如果有交流的话，我们会去帮助大家。那么下一位的演讲者呢，就是我们都知道硅谷是一个技术的核心啊，但是怎么去让这个世界上一群最聪明的人在一起工作，为了一个目标，那这一个是一个很大的课题。那么我们下一名演讲者有他自己的一些独特见解，让我们欢迎他。